Yes, that's the right one. Thanks. All right. All right. Who's here played Civilization before? Or no, you know what? I'm saying, who here has never heard of the game Civilization before? Really? You've never heard of the game or played it before? Okay. Are you like really new to tech? I'm just kidding. No, there's a. I'm going to have a couple Civilization references. Who here has knows? Who doesn't know what XKCD is? All right, good. That's a good. I just want to have a grounding for like common reference points. A tech tree for security. If later on you'll hear about Civilization. So, all right. Well, we have 2 more minutes. So. And I think it's they said it's full. So, yeah, if there's spaces in between, if y'all can squeeze in, that would be helpful. 2 minutes. Oh, yeah, yeah. Have a seat.
Hi all, thank you so much for coming. At the end of the session, there's going to be a Q&A session, so you can either ask your questions loudly or you can feel free to stand up and come to use either mics that we have placed on two sides of the aisles. Thank you so much, have a good session.
All right, 30 seconds. Just start right on time. All right, welcome everyone to our 9:40 session. It's Comprehensive Cyber Capabilities Framework, a tech tree for security. I'm Sunil Yu, and I'm joined by my co-laborers in the Comprehensive Cyber Capabilities Working Group. To my left, I have Aaron, and then Chris, and Medica, who are going to co-present with me. So, a tech tree for security. If you've ever played the game Civilization, you know the whole idea of a tech tree, which is things that precede other things, but it's supposed to have this sort of view of completeness of the kind of capabilities that we have in cybersecurity, well, or just in technology in general. But what does that look like for cybersecurity? And we're going to delve into that today, and my co-presenters here will help me go through that process. All right, standard disclaimer, which you'll see many times this week. All right, okay. So when we think about frameworks or structures and such, we have things like this comic from XKCD. It says the contiguous 41 states. Obviously, there's 7 missing, but it's hard to tell what's missing because, well, it seems like it's complete. And when we put structure together, structure helps, but it only helps if there's a predictable pattern. And going back to the previous slide, it looks like it's complete, but unless you live in those states, you probably don't know what's missing. For those who do live in those states, they're like, hey, where's Pennsylvania or North Dakota? But again, the structure only helps if there's a predictable pattern. And one of the problems that we have in cybersecurity is we don't have a predictable pattern in the buzzwords that we see in cybersecurity. And so this is something that I had a problem with when I was trying to think about what is a comprehensive set of cyber capabilities. Well, the structure that I came up with to think through that is embodied in something that I was able to discover when I was at Bank of America called the Cyber Defense Matrix. The Cyber Defense Matrix consists of 2 dimensions: things that I care about, things that I do. 5 asset classes: devices, applications, networks, data, users. 5 operational functions: identify, protect, detect, respond, recover. The combination of these creates what I call the Cyber Defense Matrix. Actually, just as a show of hands, how many folks have heard or used the Cyber Defense Matrix before? Wow, that's cool. That's awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. So the cyber defense matrix, simple 5x5 matrix, and I can stick all those buzzwords into the matrix. And now, before I couldn't figure out what the gaps are. If there's a structure, then you can figure out where the gaps are. Now, just because there's something in that box doesn't mean that it's complete. It could have a lot of things still missing. It's sort of like when you walk into a grocery store, you see shelves, you may have an aisle, but inside those shelves, you may have some shelves that are empty. And what we wanted to understand was, where do we have empty shelves? Where do we have things that are missing in the grocery store that we call of cybersecurity? Well, I started to think about this and said, okay, let's just start with identify first, the function of identify, and say, what is it that we consistently do across all types of assets? Okay, and I think the very first one is just, what assets do I have, right? What devices do I have? What applications do I have? What networks do I have? What data do I have? What users do I have? And then subsequently, you can say, well, which ones are important to me? Which devices are important to me? What applications are important to me? And so on and so forth. And we go through and ask these questions. We want to ask these questions consistently and repeatedly across all these asset classes, okay? And if you imagine this, then in the cyber defense matrix, it looks something like this, where all those letters that you saw previously are done over and over again for all those different types of assets. So let's say A, again, is inventory. Well, I'm going to want to inventory my devices, I'm going to inventory my apps, I'm going to inventory my networks, and so on and so forth. However, what we actually do probably looks more like this, okay? And it's not to say, by the way, that, going back to one slide, it's not to say that we should do all these, okay? Because doing all these may cost way too much money. The vendors would love for you to do all these, but, but practically speaking, we may only be able to do some subset of that. And so it may be something like this, but we oftentimes, when we see something like this, we don't really see what's missing. We only know what we're doing. And that's one of the challenges that we have in cybersecurity. We only see, what we see is all there is. And because what we see is all there is, we sometimes forget that there's some other activity that we should be doing as well. So again, the preface for the session is this notion of a comprehensive set of cyber capabilities. What is that comprehensive set? Can we discover it? And can we go through the process of understanding what that looks like? Because what you'll do when you go into the expo hall is you're going to just see a whole bunch of stuff. But how is that structured? How is it organized? And right now, the way it's organized, there is no real structure, right? It's just a mess of vendors out there. But what we want to be able to do is to systematically understand where does this vendor sit in the matrix? And actually, more so, what do you need, right? If you go into a grocery store, you have a sense of, here are the ingredients that I'm trying to buy for my whatever recipe you're trying to make. And being able to go straight to the aisle to pick it up is ideal. Here at RSA, good luck, right? Which aisle is endpoint detection and response in, right? So, but the perspective here is that having predictable structures helps a lot and helps us understand what do we have missing, and well, what are the activities that we could be performing, what are the activities that we need to perform, and then let's systematically think through that. So as I was working through this problem space, a company that I'm advising said, hey, we have this maturity model focused on data that we wanted to have you look at. And so, okay, great. All right, show it to me. And they showed me version 1. And I'm like, well, all right. Using the cyber defense matrix, I started to see gaps immediately, okay? And by the way, once you see these gaps, you can't unsee them, which is great, because the model helps us really see the gaps when all you see oftentimes is just what there is. So I look at this and I say, okay, well, what's missing, right? I mean, can you tell me what's missing quickly and easily? And it's hard because, again, what you see is all there is. And so I said, okay, let me go back and figure out those questions that I asked. A, what assets do I have? Is that in there? And it looks like, yeah, well, there's a data discovery function. Okay. So that seems like they have that there. The next one is data location and context. And I didn't have that in my framework. I wasn't asking that question. So maybe, is that a new question that we should be asking everything? Does it make sense for us to ask what is the location and context for applications, for networks, and so on and so forth? Data classification. whether you call it classification or prioritization, it's the same concept, right? And so we should be doing some sort of determination of what's critical, and so on and so forth. But as I was doing this, I was realizing, well, okay, hold on. I also asked for which ones are vulnerable, which assets are vulnerable, which ones are being actively exploited, who owns these assets. And if I'm asking those questions for other types of assets, shouldn't I also be asking that of my data too? Makes sense, right? So the structure helps us see where the gaps are. And then what else follows? Like what's G and H and I and J and all the way through Z? Make sense? Okay. All right, so I said, okay, this is version 1, right? 1.0, and you know how 1.0s go, right? And I said, okay, well, let's see what else we can add. So I said, the letter C in my view is which of my assets, which of my data are vulnerable. So we do a data vulnerability assessment. D might be a data exploitation assessment. E is a risk assessment. Ownership. Maybe instead of having it as a separate question, it's a subset of the discovery question. Okay, so you discover, and maybe as a part of discovering or inventorying, you're also specifying the location, but you're also specifying who owns it. Maybe it's not something separate from the discovery. Maybe it's just something that is a part of that. And then data security posture assessment. I'm sure you've heard a number of vendors talk about data security posture management. We're trying to figure out, okay, what does that fit into this construct as well? But as we were going through this exercise, some of these were like, well, does this make sense? Does it make sense in terms of what these terms or these activities mean? So we're going to hit this. Aaron's going to talk about this a little later on, but we were trying to figure out, but the word data vulnerability sounds okay, but we realize what that is actually a lot harder to process than you may think. And understanding what a data vulnerability is not as straightforward as you might think it, okay? And specifically in terms of what's the difference between a vulnerability and a misconfiguration. And this model, this analysis helps us unpack and recognize that there is a distinction there as well. But we're gonna talk about that later, and Aaron will cover that. Now, the other aspect of the model is that if I am doing something in data, then to say that it's part of the comprehensive set, it has to be applicable to another asset class. So all these letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, should also apply to other asset classes like applications and endpoints and networks and data, and we just did data, and users, okay? And so whether it's data, discovery, location, blah, 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 we also want to do the same thing with applications and say, does this make sense for me to do application discovery, application location and context, application classification, and so on and so forth. And if it doesn't, then it begs the question, wait, hold on. Is this a universal, or is this part of the comprehensive set of capabilities? All right, so we're gonna walk into that a little bit later, but the perspective here is, once we have these capabilities, then we wanna understand how to order them. And so that's where the tech tree comes in. And the question is there a common pattern for this tech tree? Well, I think people would generally agree when we start the whole process of cybersecurity, we almost always talk about having to do asset management first. And asset management, the basic function there is to basically just tell me what you have, right? And so the first step is inventorying and discovering. The next step is usually then prioritization and classification. However, we oftentimes skip both of those steps and we go straight to vulnerability scanning. Sound familiar? Okay. All right. And why do we do that? Well, it's because we have a crappy inventory and we have no idea what's important to the business. And so we just scan a bunch of things, hoping that it'll find whatever is important and maybe secure everything that's important. But as you guys know, when that happens, you end up with a whole bunch of vulnerabilities that no one actually really cares about. So it results in a suboptimal state, right? So if you do some of these things without doing the prerequisites first, then it becomes a mismatch, if you will. By the way, I should also mention some of these lines, we can find ways to make the lines a little bit better, but the perspective is there's a set of prerequisites to be able to do these activities. So we do vulnerability scanning. We also then want to do an assessment of the exploit against that vulnerability. Then we take all those values and do risk-based triage. We have the impact, we have the threat, we have the vulnerability. The combination of that allows us to do triage there. Now, we also have this new emerging space called posture, right? Posture assessment. And the perspective here is that it requires context to be able to understand, is this posture good or bad? Like, for example, is my posture right now good or bad? Well, it depends. If I'm trying to go to sleep, which I need sleep right now because I only got 3 hours of sleep, it's not a good posture because I should be lying prone, right? So it entirely depends on the configuration depends on the context. A vulnerability, on the other hand, doesn't depend on context, and we're going to talk about that a little later. But context, what kind of context are we talking about? And it turns out the context that we need comes from the other asset classes too. So all these activities that we perform, not just for data, but also for devices, for applications, for networks, for users, these all feed into context. Because having a, let's say, an OpenS3 bucket, okay, an OpenS3 bucket is a configuration. You may want it to be open, but depending upon other things, like for example, maybe it's tied to an application that's very sensitive. Maybe you don't want that open. Or maybe it's a public application and you want it open. So the context depends, and having the information from all the other asset classes then factors into that determination as to whether or not this is good or bad. Because then once you determine that, you then move on to the next stage, which is to protect these things. So you prioritize classify, then that may lead to some function of allow listing or block listing. You determine that there's a vulnerability that needs to be to actually be addressed. You patch it. You determine that something is exploitable, so you try to mitigate that exploitation. You determine that something's misconfigured, then you go and harden it, okay? And the perspective is these then feed into other protect activities, other detect activities, and so on and so forth. So we're building out this tech tree. And we oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, we skip these steps. We skip these preceding steps. And when we do, we end up with suboptimal outcomes. And for those who've gone through the lessons learned here, you know that that is a common occurrence for us in cybersecurity. In fact, many cases, we don't even do protect. We don't even start with protect. We jump all the way to detect and start finding fires and saying, okay, what happened here? Let's go back and figure out what we have, how do we secure it, and then capture logs and so on and so forth. So the basic idea here is that we want to come up with this tech tree, and my belief is that, my assertion is that whether you're dealing with data or users or devices or applications, there's a common tech tree pattern that emerges. And I hope you're able to see that as well. Okay, so to understand though, like what are all the different letters, what you saw previously, like A, B, C, D, all the way through Z, what are those activities? To be able to understand the tech tree, you also need to understand what is that comprehensive set of activities, right? And to do that, we looked at a whole bunch of frameworks, and it was eye-watering. But that's, hey, by the way, I shouldn't make it sound so bad, but this is a working group, okay? Which means that we invite people to be part of the working group, and we will put you to work. But it is sometimes eye-watering, but man, we learned a ton of new things. And so to talk about some of the work that we did in looking at those frameworks, I'm going to turn it over to my co-presenter, Medika, who's going to talk about her analysis of the frameworks. So over to her.
Great. Thank you, Sunil. So I'm sure some of you are wondering, are you kidding me? Another framework? We have a plethora of them, right? And as with standards, right, if it's not invented here, let's invent a new one. But one of the reasons that I really, really, really love this work is because there's still an evolution needed in terms of how do you organize and structure security in an organizational environment. And I know that many CISOs, when they do that, they actually look at multiple frameworks and then cobble their strategy together from a multiple of them. And so the security frameworks, the evolution in the last 2 decades has really been pretty interesting to observe and be a part of. So some frameworks are holistic, so they try to be comprehensive to all things cybersecurity in an organization and try to structure it so that you do have some structure when you're looking at how do you mature your program. Other frameworks are focused specifically on a certain industry, maybe healthcare or maybe the energy sector. Then also, along with that, some frameworks are control-based, so they're very prescriptive in what you should be doing, while others are more governance-focused. And then you also have the strategic versus tactical versus operational. And some frameworks blend some of these aspects, some are just focused on one specific thing. And what we're trying to do here with the data-centric cybersecurity maturity model is to focus specifically on data and try to look at it from a strategic and tactical perspective. So if we look at it from the physical world, we're all familiar with maps, right? If you're trying to figure out where in the world you want to travel, you might look in an overall global map. If you're in a specific country, then you might want to see, hey, you know, what areas of this region do I want to visit? If you're in a city, you want to look at, you know, where are some of these attractions that you want to see and so on and so forth. And we all know that, hey, if later on your friends are inviting you to a bar later tonight, you're not going to look at a map that's talking about the continents, right? That's not the appropriate map for you to look at. So one of the things that we're trying to do with this data-centric maturity model, and again, we're soliciting added input and having more members join us, is that we want to be more at the 50,000 to 25,000 level. So be very strategic, but also in some way tactical, and have people understand what do they need to do to actually meet those strategic requirements. And so if we look at you know, this particular picture, it shows you some of the frameworks that exist and where they fall in. And in my last CISO job, one of the things that I decided to use was the NIST cybersecurity framework for an overall governance structure along with the CIS controls, because that gave me a governance model along with on-the-ground operational controls so that I could have a comprehensive strategy. Now, the next couple of slides, I'm not going to go into detail, but I volunteered to do the eye-watering work of looking at a lot of these frameworks and kind of where they fit in. And let me tell you, it's fascinating. So these four frameworks, I think most of you will be familiar with because most organizations require this for compliance, right? So you need to have a third-party auditor that actually says, yes, you're compliant with these frameworks. And so ISO 27001 is mostly governance focused, although it does have an annex that talks about the 114 controls that you should have in place to then meet that governance function, right? The 27002 is mostly control based. The SOC 2 is also holistic and controls based, and PCI DSS is for the specific area of the payment industry and controls based. So then, you know, there's more. So these particular frameworks, except for the last one, all deal with privacy. And when, you know, when Sunil talked about identifying data, right, and what data do you have, when you look at it from the privacy perspective, it's interesting because for GDPR, it talks about personal information and for entities that are in Europe. Of course, other countries and other cities or states like California are creating their own privacy regulatory requirements. But it's mostly for personal identifiable information. Then you've got things like HIPAA that deal with EPHI, so anything healthcare related. But as an organization, what if you have information that you want to keep private, such as some business analytics or so? Maybe there's privacy aspects to that that is not covered anywhere. And these are some of the gaps that we're looking at, like how do you actually fulfill them? And then CIS I talked about has a very nice structure. And even these frameworks are evolving, right? When I became a CISO at my last job, they had just come out with version 8. Well, they changed some of the domains, they decreased them, but it was really nice because it also tied into this cybersecurity maturity model, right? But again, these are always evolving, so you always have to keep up with these frameworks as well. Then the NIST cybersecurity framework, right, first version came out in 2014, and it's very largely embraced by a lot of organizations because it was the first time that it actually articulated from a business perspective how to holistically look at governance of cybersecurity. So very holistic, also has controls. And then there are some of the other frameworks. I'm not going to go through them in detail. What we're going to end up doing in our paper is actually as an appendix have more details about these so that people can understand where it fits in. And I'm looking for other people to do this eye-watering work. So these particular frameworks mostly relate to governmental aspects. So specifically in the US, if you are a government contractor, then there's a requirement that you, meet the issues in these frameworks. So one of the things, as you go to all these vendors later on, most of these frameworks are similar but different. And they have probably 70% or 80% of the controls that are controls-based are similar. And so what I've liked in the last 5 years that a lot of vendors have made it easier to actually see which controls apply to much of these frameworks to make compliance aspects much easier. But what really, really grabbed me with this work on the data-centric cybersecurity model is that, to me, it blended what I had been trying to do with the NIST cybersecurity framework and the CIS controls, because we're looking at a governance function that pertains specifically to data, and also trying to be somewhat prescriptive so that in an organization you know what to do to reach a certain maturity when you're looking at overall data security. And as Sunil was mentioning, if you're looking at the identity and classify aspect, really that is the first step you should do. And you have suggestions or requirements, like in ISO 27001, that tell you that yes, you should do asset management, and yes, you should classify, and they kind of leave it at a very high level, right? Make sure that access is controlled so nobody can modify the asset, which implicitly they're talking about data as well. But there never has been any kind of framework that explicitly talks about data. The CIS model does have 3 controls for data, for identify, but they're missing the aspects of, well, what is the data that is really important, and what is the context, where does it sit, right? If I look at what is really important data to me, something that a lot of environments miss is credentials, right? Credentials are the way that most criminal activity happens and starts, and that's where they start their reconnaissance. Yet how many people actually look at, can we identify all the credentials that we use? Do we know where they're backed up? Who's using them from where, right? And having that added context for that specific set of data is, I think, really important. And so one of the aspects that this work also is doing, it also will facilitate cohesiveness across the security and privacy realms, right? Typically, a CISO will own most of the security aspects, but privacy is owned by the DPO or the general counsel. Yet most of the controls are very security related when you're dealing with privacy regulations. So this data-centric model that we're creating will help to provide cohesiveness from both the security and privacy aspect. So that's my section. I will now hand it over to Aaron.
Thanks, Medica. So now you've heard a lot about what this working group has been doing. And I honestly didn't know what to expect when I started working with these folks on this idea, but it has been an amazing adventure. There are so many interesting questions to wrangle with when we're doing this kind of work. And Chris is going to tell you in a little bit how you can get involved. I'm going to try to tease you with some of the challenges that you could expect if you chose to join us on this journey. So we have a goal in mind. You've heard a bit about how we're trying to make this comprehensive tech tree and how we're focusing on data. We need to be able to communicate that, and we need to be able to tell security leaders like you, our managers, our boards of directors, why this work is so important and why it's so different from other things. We've also got some technical edge cases that have come up. Sunil teased that a little bit, and we'll dive into that a little bit more in a second. So I'm going to talk about some of these interesting challenges, the debates we've had, and how we need you to join us and push the pace forward. So we all know that analogies are very helpful, especially when we're talking to executives, especially when we're talking to people outside of cybersecurity. We have a bunch of analogies that we've used in this presentation so far, and a couple more that we use as an industry, right? The biggest one, the castle. It's defense in depth. We all know it, we all love it, we all embrace it. We had a discussion with this group about whether that analogy really works to help us. And the reality is, like, on one hand, we're stuck with it. There is absolutely no way for us to talk about the controls that we need to implement to secure our data without talking about the ways that we would wrap it in things like encryption or intrusion detection or some other castle analogy, moding, whatnot. But on the other hand, it's not really great with executives. It doesn't really talk about the journey or the trade-offs or the risks that we're trying to manage. And so it doesn't really work for us. Then there's the physical world. You saw that before. It's pretty good. Like, we all understand we zoom in and out and we have 50,000-foot views. And we also talked about another one, which is the idea of a mountain, right? Really getting at this journey of how you transcend the different transitions. But none of them work 100% of the way. If we think about an atlas, we all know that we're going to equate scale and scope. We all understand the world. We all understand the city. We know that if you wanted to get directions to the bathroom here at RSA, you wouldn't want a map of continents. And at the same time, if you're trying to get from San Francisco to Mumbai, a street-level map of San Francisco doesn't really help you much. So that makes sense, and that's relevant. When you chart it to the cybersecurity frameworks, though, you get to see. We have these giant holistic frameworks, the NIST CSF, the Cyber Defense Matrix. And then at the bottom, we have these very, very tactical, functional, operational ideas. You wouldn't talk about your email security program at the 50,000-foot view. Your email security, the attack surface is small. It doesn't make sense in that context. Similarly, I wonder if any of you use MITRE ATT&CK in your security awareness training, because I feel like that's a bit dissonant too, right? Medica talked about how these frameworks can be holistic or they can be prescriptive. So here's the problem. When we looked at connecting these frameworks and trying to draw the lines between them and figuring out what's what, we got to a point where we couldn't understand where a maturity model really fit in. The data security maturity model we've been working with, it's not holistic, and it's not prescriptive. It does have levels, and some of the controls frameworks have levels, but other than that, it doesn't really talk like the ducks. And so we think that it kind of fits in between. And so if we're talking about an atlas, I don't know, maybe the DSMM is the index. It's the thing you look at to figure out which page you need to go to understand what you're trying to do. And that could work. It absolutely could. But when I think about trying to talk this way to somebody who doesn't really understand the work we do, it still misses the journey. It still misses the trade-offs. Yeah, it gives us a map to the different things, but it doesn't help us understand why or where we're going. So then we move on to this mountain analogy.
Actually, Aaron, before you go
Sure.
back, if you go back one slide, we should also recognize that the board of directors is at the 100,000, maybe 200,000-foot view. And understanding adjacent levels is possible. Understanding 2 levels down, good luck.
Good luck, yes. So maybe this is better. Maybe this works. Let's try it out. So this is about a journey, right? Getting from the ground to Base Camp 1 of Everest, or maybe even summiting some of these smaller 7 summits, it's not too hard. We could do it. We need special skills. We need special tools. We need to understand where we're going and how. Each transition is going to get progressively harder, so we might need different tools along the way. This is sounding pretty good. Also, not everybody sets out with the idea that they want to summit Everest, right? Maybe getting to Base Camp 2 is enough. You don't need the belt and suspenders in your data security program necessarily. So now I think we're tracking. But here's the problem. If I took this to an exec, the exec might say something like, well, Aaron, why don't we just buy a helicopter, land ourselves at the top of Everest, take your oxygen tanks, take some food, whatever, like, we're done, good, right? Like, a vendor can sell us this. And I think that that really misses the point of the journey. And the idea that we do have to struggle and wrestle with some of these concepts. And so it's important to know that those transitions matter and that work matters. And so I think we ran into problems with this one too. But enough about the analogies, enough about the sort of meta discussion. You came here for hardcore tech talk and more XKCD comics, right? All right. So, what the heck is a data vulnerability? I submit to you that little Bobby Tables, he might be a data vulnerability. We have these definitions of vulnerability. Now, not everybody agrees on what a security vulnerability is actually defined as. And as Sunil said earlier, sometimes we think that misconfigurations are vulnerabilities, and they're not, right? A vulnerability is a vulnerability, no matter where it exists in your stack. That system that's running an unpatched version of Windows, I don't care if it's behind 17 firewalls, it still poses a threat to your environment, and you can still patch it. But a misconfiguration could absolutely be critical to your business. Your tool is going to tell you it's a problem, and you're just going to go in and silence the alert because you've done the research and you know that that's how we want it to run. But Bobby's not a bug. He's not a flaw. He might have been a mistake. It might have been an accident. But he's not an error. And the problem with Bobby is that when you try to process his data through your system fails in an unexpected way. And so this kind of ticks a lot of the boxes of what a vulnerability is. But what do you think?
Well, so, and this is where we've had a really active debate about, like, what is the nature of a vulnerability? And is this a data vulnerability or is this an application vulnerability? In which case, if it's an application vulnerability, then, again, what's a data vulnerability? And it can really get a lot of academic discussion, but at the fundamental question is, if there's a vulnerability, then what's the patch? Okay? I mean,
Exactly.
so, like, if I'm calling this a data vulnerability and it's not a misconfiguration, so in other words, a configuration is it could be good or bad based on context. So I could have an OpenS3 bucket and it's fine. All these other scanners will say, hey, you have an OpenS3 bucket, but I can tell it, look, it's meant for public access. So it's not a misconfiguration, and it's certainly not a vulnerability.
So maybe the fact that Bobby's name, which this is his legal name, right? We all know his parents gave him this name. Maybe the fact that it's his name and it's personally identifiable as the data, maybe that's the vulnerability.
Right, so this whole notion of it being personally identifiable implies that this information is inherently problematic, okay? And so is that a data vulnerability? Meaning your social security number has an inherent problem. But again, what's the patch? If your social security, if the number by itself is a vulnerability, it represents a vulnerability, then what's a patch?
So you see how this is getting us and where we're trying to go, and how there aren't really easy answers here. No matter what the resolution to this question is, we need your help to think it through and to really figure out if we can make this work as a holistic framework, as something that applies to all of the asset classes. It seems easy, but it really isn't. So with that, I'm gonna...
And let me just to
finish.
give you a perspective, Medica also mentioned it earlier, is some of the privacy-enhancing technologies out there, does that represent the patch? In other words, how do I tokenize Bobby Tables' social security number? Is that a patch? Okay. Trust me, I'm sometimes pulling my hair out trying to figure this out. So this is where we need your help and to think through this really thorny issues.
So if you want to do this with us, Chris is going to tell you how to get involved.
Right. Thank you, Aaron. And I'll just attest to this, like this sort of conversation and debate, this is what we have in the working group kind of every session. So yeah, it's great to be here. I'm going to spend probably, 5 minutes talking through where we go next, talking through a little bit about what DSM is, what we've done so far, and then where we're going to go after the RSA conference. So everyone's familiar with NIST CSF. America did a great job breaking down various different frameworks, but we don't feel that there's been any form of maturity model that really puts data first. And I'm going to steal something Aaron said to me, 2 or 3 days ago, which was he's sick of data being a second-class citizen. We have all these different frameworks, all these different maturity models, and where does data really get its place? And we haven't seen anything to date. So if you look here on the left-hand side of the slide, we have the NIST CSF domains. And the way that we've approached DSMM is to take 3 levels of maturity for each of those domains and define specific objectives for not just governance, but technical controls, process, and how organizations can actually get actionable and measure some of these points in their own environment. America mentioned that we want your help, and we certainly do, I think. So we're now opening up DSMM to be open source. And by that, I mean that we've put it on GitHub. That's a first place. From there, you can see some of the more documented conversations I think that we've had in terms of what is a data vulnerability, in terms of what we need to do, when and where. We've also put some control alignment in there, and we'll put the URLs on screen in a moment, but when you go and have a look, we have now got to the stage of having distinct, kind of almost atomic measurements of this control versus what other domains are doing or what other frameworks are doing moving forward. So that's very much something that we've started with control references and we'll be taking forward after the conference. And then just the roadmap. So the roadmap's really to get different practitioners involved to kind of help us in various different areas. So we say it's fair, it's largely been CISOs thus far that have been involved. We'd like to get people familiar with incident response, cryptographers, people working in architecture, various different members of the community to come and help us. That's pretty much an overview of where we're going to go. I mentioned GitHub. So we now have DSMM live. We've got it here on a specific URL that we'll share, but it's also available on datasecurity.org. We'd love your input. We'd love your input on what we've done thus far. And also, please do reach out to come and help, really. I think we're at time, but... So, we want to wrap up and we got time on this?
So thanks, Chris. And for those who are wondering, like, why do we start with data? There's a lot of things that you'd be surprised. There's this implicit belief that we're securing data, but it's not explicit, actually, in a lot of these frameworks that we saw. Isn't that shocking to you in some respects, that there's not an explicit set of activities that we do with data? What oftentimes happens is we address the things around the data, okay? Mm-hmm. Meaning we have it on a network, or we have it on an endpoint. We got to secure the endpoint, and we got to secure the network, but not the data itself, which gets back to the question of, like, what is a data vulnerability? How do we patch a data vulnerability? So we picked the data as a starting point because it was like, despite it being something that you think should be addressed explicitly, it turned out there were a lot of implicit aspects of how we're supposed to secure this thing, and yet it seems like it's a big gap in our industry. So anyway, so some of the things that you guys can do next week. Look at DSMM.
Yeah. We'd like you to go to docs.datasecurity.org, take a look at DSMM, tell us what you think works. Like I said, there's an issue-based approach to GitHub, so please do raise any concerns that you have there. And we'd love you to get involved, definitely.
And then for those who aren't familiar with the Cyber Defense Matrix, my company, Jupiter One, is going to hand out free copies, and I do have them in my backpack, and they are heavy. Please get rid of them for me.
Great stuff.
All right. We'd love to see whether or not you can benchmark yourself against the different levels of maturity within DSMM.
Massively so. And we'll fingers crossed over the next few months, we'll actually be developing some form of tooling to kind of help you. Big proponents on this board of kind of open SAM and general OWASP things. So if we can do that for DSMM, I mean, we're going to need your help with it, but that's kind of the direction we want to go in.
And there are gaps everywhere, okay?
Yeah.
Once you see them, you can't not see them. But the parallel structures, the analogies that we gave you, and the nice thing is, Aaron went through a couple of different analogies, but the best analogies oftentimes are the other asset classes. What do we do for devices? What do we do for applications? What do we do with networks? And when we see that we do these things with these other asset classes, all of a sudden we're like, well, wait, how come we don't do that with data? And so the analogy, the cyber defense matrix is an analogy-making machine that just presents you a ready-to-go analogy with the other asset classes. So help us find those gaps, and you'll find them as you study them as well.
Perfect, yeah.
And then, yeah, again, this is a working group with a bunch of other security practitioners. We invite you to join us. We will put you to work.
Yeah,
But
we
we
will.
also just want feedback on like what you see on the GitHub page, and with that, we'll take questions.
Yeah. Great.
You want to use the mic?
So has any organization already adopted this framework?
Sorry.
Any company adopted this framework? Have you seen it in working?
It's the early days, so we've started to apply it. So I'm CSO for Cyberhaven. We've started to apply various different principles of DSMM within our environment. But as Merica pointed out, most of the work so far has been kind of defining which frameworks have got gaps and where DSMM is bridging those gaps. So partly when we get people on board, helping use it in your environment and feeding back is very much what we want to do.
And a lot of VCs have actually adopted it because they're trying to find companies that will solve those problems for us.
Thank you.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah, you can go ahead.
Duncan, go ahead.
Sure. So you say you want help and you want us to join. You sort of given places to go. How do we actually join your working group? Is that on those places?
Yeah, if you go to DSMM, so docs.datasecurity.org will outline, it's a fully searchable static site. So you can go there, has all the control objectives. As I mentioned, it has the specific
Is there a sign up
points.
though?
There is on DSMM, yeah, datasecurity.org. There is a reaching
so if
out
we go
point.
there, there's some link or click on
Yeah,
it.
yeah,
Say,
yeah.
hey, if
There's
I
a
wanna go to
there's a
your
form there.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Oh, okay, we got to fix that. We'll fix that. Well, datasecurity.org will have a link to hopefully soon.
Okay, cool.
So,
Go ahead.
you brought a new thing for us, like, data vulnerability. Are you seeing these kind of a stuff in, like, when we are going to implement, if we see something new, so how we will tackle with that? My first question. My second question is that looks like it is another framework, So how you see it different than other frameworks, quote unquote, typical frameworks?
Cool. Shall I do the second bit first, and then you can do that? So we acknowledge that. We don't want this to just be something that someone tries to shoehorn and do in isolation. So the study that we've done on existing frameworks and our own definition of control categories will be the way that you can map those. So I don't know how familiar you are with CSF, but if you take the breakdown that they've done against PCI, ISO 27002, we plan to have that level of crossover on where DSMM sits, because nothing else is touching on data in a data-first model. That's our belief. Again, as you're part of this group, please do reach out and tell us otherwise. But
So, and also, my hope is that my hope is that it doesn't necessarily stay as it's standalone, but rather that the things that we find as gaps get incorporated into the other frameworks. So we're finding gaps all over, and
Yeah.
we're basically saying, hey, you guys left this out. You should probably put that in, okay, into whatever framework already exists.
Yeah, and just one last point for me, and that's why I said we want different security domains and different types of practitioners to feedback, because we will give you a CISO's view, but having other people feedback is going to help close those gaps, I think. Yeah,
Thank you.
no problem.
Go ahead.
Okay.
He was still
All
before
right.
me.
Go ahead.
Yeah, just kind of curious when you were presenting your presentation, and I work for a software company. We're a vendor to a lot of companies, and I think about all the death by Excel and questionnaires that we get in for vendor risk assessment. And there's 300 global security frameworks. There's 204 NIST 800 series documents. We can't be compliant with them all. But fortunately, we found this tool called the Secure Controls Framework.
SCF.
And they've got a great matrix, and it scrolls on and on and on of all the mappings. Do you foresee, or is it on your roadmap of integrating this into the Secure Controls Framework?
Yeah, so I think SCF is actually one layer below the control-centric one. So this is hard to figure out also what altitude it's at. But the level of detail that's in SCF, I think is great. But maybe perhaps at the 15,000 foot view or 20,000 foot view, I'm not sure. Okay. But I think we should probably figure out where those things are. Okay, just so that we know what connects to what. And we haven't really. This is conjecture, but one that I think will help us understand. Does it make sense for us to have some of these very prescriptive guidelines in something that's actually more descriptive and combine it into the same framework? Maybe, maybe not. Okay.
Look at SCF
huge proponent of it
Yeah.
and tried to map it to what we were doing, and there are so many gaps in it for this.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not 100%, but I think of like right now, some things that are really hot that we're getting beat up, especially is in Italy, there's CVCN, in Spain, there's ENS, and they're all data-centric security controls. So we're kind of paralyzed, and I imagine we're not the only software vendor in this world going, okay, what does this map to, and what can we show that we can take credit for?
Also, just real quickly, just because there exists A through Z doesn't mean that we do all A through Z.
Okay.
It means we say we know what exists, and we make risk-based decisions to determine what we're going to actually do. Okay. But what I don't want is for us to be neglectful of things that we could do, but we can't spend forever either, right?
Right, cool, thank you.
No problem.
So I was with you up to you said you can't decide on the definition of vulnerability, and you focused on data. Because data has no bugs. It's the result. Like so a data vulnerability is any unintended use of data should be a vulnerability. Like anything else, my board doesn't care. Like they don't care where the vulnerability is. They don't care that it was a misconfiguration. They don't care that it was a software patch. They don't care that someone set up the application wrong, or someone set up the storage wrong, or someone set up the bucket wrong, or whatever. All they care is someone got access to data they shouldn't have. If you're arguing about that, how do you plan to make progress at the board level, which is ultimately the thing that we need to decide that this is something worth using? Otherwise, it's just yet another thing we do that then has to be translated again for the board, who doesn't actually care.
Yeah, so keep in mind, the board doesn't care about vulnerabilities either. I mean, they don't care about specific vulnerabilities. They care about, do you have a program to manage vulnerabilities?
That's not really true.
Well, if you try to tell your board about, hey, we have this CVE, blah, blah, blah.
No, they don't
like,
care
what
about the
the heck are you
CVE.
talking about?
They care that we are vulnerable and how we are vulnerable. And the ability to translate that into something measurable is what's important. This is how we're vulnerable. This is how we've responsibly spent your money, right? This is how bad it will be when it all goes sideways, right? And that's frankly where NIST and MITRE and all the rest of these kind of leave us short, is they don't really do a good job of that. They give us a ranking, but don't say how bad it's going to be. And that's what my board asks.
Yeah, and this is exactly the dialogue that we want, right, to have. And it's interesting because we did have a lot of discussion around what is a data vulnerability, and I'm like, well, what if you don't have integrity around the data, right? If somebody is just modifying it, right, and purports that this is the actual data, so is that a vulnerability or not? Right, so it's not correct data, but how do you know that, and is that a vulnerability? So this is exactly the kind of dialogue we need to have, because some of what we're trying to do is structure the different asset classes, right, and have a uniform look and feel as per the cyber defense matrix. So can we do that for data, right? And this is where the dialogue is. So I love this input.
I would say, again, this is the sort of conversation we have at the working groups. I would say that the board cares about business impact, and I would say that by using something like DSMM, we're then in a situation to see how mature we are against those controls, how likely something is to get their attention and they're concerned about. So that's the way that I would look at it. You have vulnerabilities, controls mitigate the impact or likelihood of risk. That's the approach that we're taking with DSMM, I would say.
Okay, last
Thank you.
question.
Thank you.
Thank you. Really awesome work. Sounds great. We had also experienced that we struggled same things, but such a very quick comment is that what we struggled especially is data integrity, how to map data integrity issues, and how to understand that how well you are doing actually with data integrity. So that's maybe thing be looking for.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I agree. Right.
Okay, thank you very much, and we'll be over here for questions further up.